All my life I had seen old Chiang coming and going, his head held high, his walking stick in his hand. His lips were always tightly shut, and he spoke to no one. No child in the alley would dare to climb into his courtyard to steal his mulberry leaves. Sampopo said that he had always been stubborn, and since his son-in-law had been executed as a counter-revolutionary, he had become even more obstinate and solitary. I was not surprised when he became a target of the Red Guards. In fact, I was proud of them for having the nerve to face him. Ji Yong had been playing with his friends and had heard the trouble start. Some Red Guards asked to borrow Old Chan's bicycle, and he refused. The Red Guards had been shocked. When they asked to borrow a bicycle from a black family in the name of the Cultural Revolution, they were not used to being refused. The whole neighborhood had heard their swearing and their threats. You stubborn counter-revolutionary's family member, we'll see which is tougher, your damned old bones or our proletariat dictatorship. When they returned the next afternoon, we were not surprised. I heard the familiar sound of drums and gongs and looked out the window. About 15 Red Guards and Six Fingers as well bustled in and out of Chiang's gate. I went back to my reading. A spate of loud but indistinct shouts grew us all out into the balcony. Several angry Red Guards pushed old Chiang roughly out the door. One of them put a wooden washboard on the sunny ground in front of the propaganda wall. He shouted something in the old man's face and pointed at the washboard. Old Chiang stood very straight, leaning slightly on his cane. He said something, and the Red Guards burst out shouting once more. The old man just shook his head. Suddenly, one of the Red Guards jumped forward. He kicked the cane out of old Chiang's hand and savagely pushed him down on his knees onto the sharp ridges of the washboard. Oh my heavens, Grandma gasped. She took Ji Yong and Ji Yun back inside. I did not move. At first, old Chiang knelt on the washboard with defiant erectness. His posture showed no sign of the pain he must have felt. Then slowly he began to droop. Occasionally he would sense a Red Guard watching him pull himself up, but for longer and longer periods his gray head was bowed. His wife followed some Red Guards back and forth, saying something and gesturing in supplication. They did not even look at her, but busily carried things from old Chiang's house to the truck waiting outside the door. After half an hour, she went inside the house and once more, and then she went inside the house once more and then returned with an enamel cup. She knelt beside her husband and held the cup to his mouth. He raised his head and took a few grateful sips. As she lowered the cup, a Red Guard turned around and casually kicked it out of her hand. The water glittered in the hot sun. I felt sick to my stomach. I went back inside. It was all terribly unnecessary. He was so determined, but so wrong. If he had just lent them the bicycle, none of this would have to happen. What is happening? Grandma asked anxiously. She lay on her bed with a cold towel on her forehead. Still the same. I shook my head and said no more. I tried to sit and read, but found myself pacing up and down the room. My knees hurt when I thought about the washboard, and my head felt dizzy when I imagined the sun burning down on him. Poor man, he might get heat stroke, I murmured to Grandma, but immediately I scolded myself. How could I feel sorry for a counter-revolutionary's family member who refused to support the Red Guards? Still, I could not help going back out to look at him. His head was drooping feebly now, and his hands were propped on the ground to keep him from collapsing. His wife sat on the ground beside him, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. All afternoon, I kept going back to the balcony to look. An hour passed, and another hour, and each time I looked, he was still there. Finally, we heard a shout from his wife. We ran to the balcony. Old Chiang had fainted. He lay on his side, half over the washboard, with his sunburned face on the ground. Several Red Guards rushed out of the house. They looked flustered as they talked among themselves. After a few minutes, they picked the old man up and carried him into the house. They loaded their truck with all the things they had confiscated, including the bicycle that Chiang had refused to lend them. I watched them drive slowly away. The only thing left behind at the base of the wall were a walking stick, a washboard, and an enamel cup lying on its side. Even early in the morning, the day did not seem fresh. The heavy air seemed to slow the working of my mind. My basket of vegetables dragged heavily on my arm. I passed the propaganda wall and could not help glancing at the ground where old Chiang had knelt yesterday. I started down the alley, but a hushed crowd at Annie's back door drew me reluctantly down the side lane. People were packed outside the kitchen, craning to see into the backyard. Jumped out of the bathroom window, I heard. Through the awning of the courtyard. Blood. I looked around in a daze. Old Chan kneeling, afraid she'd be next. The voices continued to buzz around my ear. I found myself at the front of the crowd, staring at the pieces of the shattered awning. I heard Annie's grandmother's name and shuddered. Annie's grandmother had jumped out the window. My lips trembled and my teeth began to chatter. Only a few days ago, I had visited her to ask her when Annie would return from Shandong. She had served me green bean soup she had made herself. She had said that she would like to have Annie and me accompany her to a dentist appointment when it was cooler, and then I'll buy you some peaches. Her missing front teeth made ch sounds like z. Annie's grandmother was short and skinny, and she tottered on her bound feet. Her husband had been a wealthy man, a capitalist. He had owned a dye factory, but he had died a long time ago. For as long as I could remember, Annie's grandmother had lived with her only child, Annie's mother, Teacher Wei, and Annie's father, and her elder sister, who was blind. Annie's grandmother took care of them all. I had known her so long that I called her Grandma too. Grandma and her sister always dressed in black. Sometimes I saw them up on the roof of their apartment, smoking a water pipe and talking together in their funny Ningbo accent. Grandma loved to give us treats. If Annie and I teased or bantered while we studied together, Grandma would say, "Don't be naughty, girls. Do your homework and then Grandma will give you a treat." When we were greedy, we pretended to quarrel, and it always worked. We thought she did not know this. We thought she did not know we did this. "Is that white stuff her brain?" a boy's shrill voice called as I turned numbly away. I could not bear to hear any more. Even though she had committed suicide, I went to Grandma's memorial service at the crematorium. Through the tall window, I could see across the courtyard the chimney looming high above, steadily emitting black smoke. The dirty white walls, the white cars of light sheets, the white uniforms on the crematorium workers, and the white, expressionless faces of the dead as they were rolled by all combined to produce an oppressive chill. The acrid smoke and its pervasive smell made me sick to my stomach. Annie's grandma lay in a cart, silent under the white sheet. Her face was covered. It had been smashed in the fall, and of course, they would not make a wax replacement for a suicide. Suicide was a crime. It was alienating oneself from the people, according to what Chairman Mao said. So we were not in one of the private rooms. We were in the morning. We wore no mourning bands. We could not play funeral music for Grandma. The door opened. We heard the sounds of the traditional dirge grow louder, and so did the screams and wails coming from a memorial ceremony in the private room. A cart trundled by, carrying a body draped in white. The hollow rumble of the hard wheels on the concrete floor went around the corner and slowly died away. Annie and her parents stood beside the cart where Grandma lay. Their heads were bowed. No one said a word. Someone stuck his head out an office door and shouted at Teacher Wei, 5 more minutes. Without waiting for an answer, he slammed the door shut. Annie couldn't hold back her sobs and cried out. Grandma was so dear to her. When Annie had an asthma attack, Grandma often had to take her to the hospital for oxygen. As Annie grew, the job became more and more difficult. Grandma often had to stop for a few minutes before she could continue to move down the stairs from the 3rd floor with Annie on her back. Once Annie said Grandma had to sit on the stairs and scoot down step by step with Annie on her lap. I suddenly remembered a day last summer when I had gone into their house and found Grandma, soaked in sweat herself, holding Annie's long hair off her neck and fanning her. I dropped my eyes to the floor and heard the slow music of the dirge, louder for a moment, then soft again. I shut my eyes and pictured Grandma standing on the windowsill, looking down into the courtyard. What was she thinking before she jumped? She must have forgotten about her duties to her country and her family too. Did she think about her granddaughter rushing back from Shandong for the funeral? Did she remember her blind sister? I wiped at my tears and took a deep breath. A kind but shockingly cheerful man in a white uniform appeared. "I'm sorry, but I'll have to take her away now. My boss is already on my back about giving you too much time." Annie and Teacher Wei both threw themselves on the cart, sobbing bitterly. The man looked around nervously. "You guys better be careful, or they'll say you're allying yourself with a bad class, with a suicide and all." We heard a door open down the hall. Suddenly, the man pulled Annie off the cart and pushed it away around the corner. Annie threw her arms around her mother, and they both wailed. We heard the hollow rumble of the cart and a squeaky wheel going eek, eek, eek into the distance.